You should have a message on your screen just confirming that it's recording. So first up, we have Dr. Maurice Stierl, who is a lecturer in international relations in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. He's also taught at the University of Warwick and the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on migration struggles in contemporary Europe and Northern Africa, and is broadly situated in the fields of international political sociology, political geography, and migration, citizenship, and border studies. And his book, Migrant Resistance in Contemporary Europe, was published by Routledge in 2019. So Maurice's paper is titled The Mediterranean as a Carceral Seascape. So Maurice, over to you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I hope you can see my shared screen. Okay, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll talk about this paper which was published last year in Political Geography. So in late May 2019, this group of people on the left-hand side was trying to escape from Libya on this small wooden boat. The Italian Maritime Rescue Coordination Center was alerted to this group in distress, as was the Maltese Rescue Coordination Center. Also, military assets of Italy and also of the EU's naval force Mediterranean spotted this boat from the sky. Closest to the distressed was this boat on the right, the Maridai 601, which is a supply vessel. They were instructed to proceed to the distressed. According to one of the rescued who I interviewed later on, the crew of the supply ship approached them but kept their distance and simply observed them for some time until some of the distressed started to jump into the water, swam towards the supply ship, and were then taken on board. They begged the crew to rescue the others, which they did. The captain of the Maridai supply vessel then contacted the Maltese and Italian authorities, but these refused to coordinate a disembarkation in Europe. Instead, they directed them to Tunisia, but the Tunisian authorities were equally unwilling to have the migrants land in Tunisia. And so they ordered the captain to stay several nautical miles off Tunisia's coast, though within Tunisia's search and rescue zone. Then over the next 19 days, the supply ship turned from a floating refuge into an offshore carceral space in which the situation for the rescue deteriorated. So food and water were scarce, injuries worsened, scabies also spread. And eventually, only after about 3 weeks, did the captain receive the permission to disembark the rescued in Tunisia in Zerzis. So in my article, I trace the movements and the incarcerations of this group of mostly Bangladeshi minors and men, and I collectively refer to them as the Maridai 75. So I wanted to know how they came to Libya, how they came to leave Libya on this wooden boat, how they managed to move into the search and rescue zone, only to end up on the supply vessel in the Tunisian search and rescue zone on a Belize-flagged vessel owned by an Egyptian company. And so my article notes a bit of background, and it notes that the Mediterranean region is quite a specific border zone where migrant boats often navigate not only spaces that are, sovereign sort of state spaces, but also those outside. For example, when they leave Libya, they have to navigate out of the Libyan territorial waters, the contested Libyan search and rescue zone. As you can see here, the search and rescue zones. They also regularly pass them through spaces defined by the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea, as well as spaces where we have military presence, right? European military presence, sometimes temporary, sometimes longer term. Sorry, on these journeys, they may encounter state assets, but they also encounter a range of non-state actors, merchant vessels, ferries, yachts, and so forth. So when we look at migrant journeys across the sea, we can't really speak of sort of a moment of border crossing, right? But rather a process of navigating an expanded border zone that can also take several days. And so when we think of this, I think we also need a sort of different spatial and temporal understanding of the border. Of course, not a line one can step over, but a space or zone of overlapping and conflictual regimes, legal regimes, different responsibilities, and so forth. These overlaps and conflicts are not malfunctions, but they are structural characteristics of this maritime border zone that has also allowed EU states to simultaneously extend their sovereign privileges through forms of mobile governance, and to at the same time elude responsibilities that supposedly come with it. So in 2019, I started to follow this case also as a freelance journalist for The Guardian. I wrote a couple of pieces for The Guardian together with Lorenzo Pizzani. And in this process, I interviewed not only some of the migrants themselves, some of their relatives and friends, but I also corresponded with the Bangladeshi embassy, Tunisian NGOs, and also members of the IOM. And so why this predicament of this particular group appeared to be specific, in my article, I see them as emblematic of larger carceral dynamics that are at work in the Mediterranean. As I highlight, while borders and border enforcement, of course, also often entail carceral dimensions, I think I wanted to emphasize that in particular for the Central Mediterranean, we can see how an offshore carceral space or regime has been produced in the attempt to govern unruly forms of migration. I proceed in the article to explain a little bit how this carceral regime has evolved, especially focusing on the past 10 years or so, since the Arab uprisings changed and reconfigured this space quite dramatically, because the major factor here being that Europe's externalized frontier guards crumbled in light of anti-authoritarian uprisings, and therewith also Europe's ability to have these sort of externalized border guards control their shores. So then, especially from 2014 on, we saw unprecedented movements across the sea, and this is for all regions. So between then and the end of 21, we had over 2.2 million sea arrivals in the EU. When we look to the Central Mediterranean only, we can see how in the 2000s and even further back, the annual average arrival to Italy and Malta stood at around 23,000 people. This then increased dramatically in 2011 for the first time, where this figure was doubled to 64,000. And then especially from 2014, as you can see here, but also on this slide, we see how between 2014 and 17, the figures rise really a lot. And so we have this annual average of about 156,000 people in these 3 years. I don't have much time to discuss this here, but the initial period, 2013, 2014, is often described as sort of the time of a humanitarian turn, right? Where we had large-scale rescue operations that also involved EU actors, especially, of course, Italy. And afterwards, especially from 2014 on, we see more security-focused operations, Operation Triton by Frontex, and shortly afterwards, the EU military operation UNAFORMED carried out by EU Navy actors. And so this focus on border security then also translated into a multiplication of measures, infrastructures, and policies to capture escaping migrants from Northern Africa and to contain them elsewhere. And so I do want to, in a sort of bullet point manner, just speak quickly through some of these dynamics that came about, especially from the mid-2010s onward. In 2017, we see a range of cooperation agreements concluded between the EU and Libya in support of the latter's ability to quote-unquote manage migration. So we see huge funds being transferred to Libya, be it through the Trust Fund for Africa or through bilateral agreements, all of this going into Libya's so-called integrated border management. Besides these forms of direct financial support, we also see the donation of speedboats and military equipment that would then, of course, facilitate Libyan militias turn coast guards and intercepting migrants. We also see how Frontex and other EU actors start training Libyan officers, also in human rights protection. Then we see, besides the sort of attempts to legitimize these actors, we also see the EU support in legitimizing the Libyan search and rescue region, in which the Libyan authorities then would hold geographical competence, right? So this is, of course, hugely important to think about what will come next. At the same time, then we see how EU maritime assets are withdrawing further north and, trying to avoid rescue operations, while the EU increases its aerial presence through drones and other aerial assets, such as this Frontex drone here. And we also see how novel sort of information channels emerge, for example, between Frontex personnel and Libyan Coast Guard personnel, who sometimes exchange in WhatsApp chats. And even more directly than that, we have Italian officers station a Navy vessel in the harbor of Tripoli. You can see Tripoli at the bottom here of the screen, and working together collectively from within Libya to intercept migrants at sea, a sort of externalized maritime rescue coordination center that is being installed there, right? So as I have only 15 minutes or so, I can't really explore these developments further. I'm happy to comment on these later on. But I think what they managed to do is to collectively reduce the arrivals of migrants in Europe, right? So when we go back to this slide, we can see that between 2014 and 2017, the annual figure of arrivals really drops quite remarkably. Of course, there are also other factors here. We see then, of course, in 2020 and so on, also the role of COVID. But nonetheless, I think these figures do tell a story. We see how this sort of offshore carceral regime starts to really work much better than in the years before. When we also think about the role of interceptions, we can see, sorry, let me go back to this one. In 2017, we had about 15,000 people being intercepted to Libya. We also have about 15,000 people being intercepted to Libya in 2018, but quite clearly, right, we had over 119,000 people cross in 2017 and only 23,000 people cross in 2018. So we see really huge numbers in interceptions, and this is increasing. Also last year, we had this record number of over 32,000 people being intercepted back to Libya. So I don't think we should focus only on these figures, but I think they do tell a story, and they, show how what we see on this slide here is playing out on a sort of daily basis now in the central Mediterranean. Libyan actors chasing after migrant boats and being steered from the air by European assets. So in my article, I draw from the work of geographers such as Pauline Maillet, Alison Mounds, Kira Williams, who conceptualize this form of sort of remote control as being underwritten by what they call imperio, so a boundless, limitless administrative power through which European actors mediate jurisdiction and legal protection by virtue of geography and manipulate jurisdiction to suit political goals. And so when we return to the Meredive 75 in May 2019, we see how they were sort of caught up in this carceral maritime regime that has by that time started to work more effectively. Of course, they were not intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guards, but they were caught up in other forms of offshore containment, which had also, in light of this sort of carceral regime, multiplied at the time. So from 2018, this is not this case, it's another case, but from 2018 on, we see how merchant vessels that rescued migrants would find it increasingly tough to disembark them in Europe, right? I guess you still have this in mind, the Salvini and also Malta closing their ports and having merchant vessels sort of in standoffs outside of these ports for many weeks, sometimes over a month. And of course, this also happened in the case of the Meredive, although they were not even able to disembark in Europe, of course, in the end. So in order to avoid the considerable financial losses, we have seen how merchant vessels then have been turned increasingly into these offshore detention facilities, but also into deportation assets, right? That either return people back to Libya directly. So between 2018 and 2020, over 1,800 people were returned by merchant vessels, or where merchant vessels, as you can see on this slide, are sort of rescuing people, but then handing them over to Libyan coast guards, which would return them to Libya. So I look into these sort of intersecting developments, and we can then witness how I think offshore carcerality has been really produced in the Central Mediterranean through the interaction of a range of different actors. In the case of the Maritime 75, we see how their offshore confinement was also connected to other forms of carcerality, right? So I connect their sort of offshore carcerality to what Nick Gill and others have referred to as carceral circuits, right? How they are connected to other carceral spaces and other forms of mobile containment, if you like, right? So, for example, while the 75 were on this vessel, we had members of the Bangladeshi embassy actually go on a vessel to this boat, and they would threaten the rescue. They would force them to sign basically the agreements to be quote unquote voluntarily returned to Bangladesh, right? We also see the role of the IOM, which is a very dubious role in their case. We also see Tunisia saying basically they would have to, they couldn't stay in Tunisia itself. And so we see how the sort of offshore containment of this group of migrants for nearly 3 weeks gave these actors the time to organize their sort of flights, deportation, de facto deportation flights home, right? So we can definitely see how these forms of carceral spaces at sea and on land, of course, very much intertwined. And
Maurice, we have a minute and a half remaining.
Yeah. And this also goes for interceptions to Libya, right? So we see how carceral spaces, so the interception abilities of the Libyan coast guards are connected with carceralities on land. Often Libyan coast guard officers are selling people after disembarkation to other militias that would then detain people in formal or informal camps. And so many of the Maritime 75 actually experienced both of these fates, right? They've gone through a range of different spaces of confinement. And I will just end here by saying that in my paper, what I also really stress is the fact, though, that the group, they are not sort of passive victims in all of this, right? They're actually constitutive actors. They're not being pushed or pulled around. They determine through their actions the outcomes of distress situations and their situations in confinement. So by the time I published this piece in Political Geography last year, nearly all of the 75 had left Tunisia, and they lived dispersed across 3 continents and in 6 countries. So the majority of them had been returned to Bangladesh, but 11 of them remained and resisted and remained in Tunisia. Some of them then eventually returned again to Libya, took another boat and reached Italy. Others remained in Tunisia. They were stuck there for 2 years during COVID, unfortunately, also because they did not want to go to the sea. One of them found a visa for a non-European country for work. And now in 22, again a year later, and I learned this last month, that a large number of those who had actually been returned to Bangladesh are now back in Libya, right? So we see that they, although they had received IOM funding a little bit upon return, this was not enough to pay back their really high mountains of debt. And so they started to migrate again, took different routes to reach Libya. Some of them have already made it to Italy, and others are still stuck in Libya. I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. That was absolutely fascinating. And yeah, some great visuals in that presentation as well. Just as a reminder to everyone, please feel free to put into the chat any questions that you have for Maurice, or you are welcome to save them for our live Q&A session later in the session. So our next speaker is Andonea John Dickson. She's a lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the University of London Institute in Paris. Her research focuses on migration politics, so specifically interrogating the strategies of containment and exclusion that emerge in maritime geographies. Andonea recently completed her PhD at Queen Mary, University of London, with a thesis that examines the entanglement of the sea in methods of migration control in the Mediterranean and the proliferation of carceral practices in mobility control at sea. And Andonea's paper is The Making of Carceral Seas in Migration Governance, Australia's at-sea detentions and coerced mobilities. Thank you, Andonea.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen and time myself as well so I can keep track. So thank you so much, first of all, for having me as part of this really exciting panel. The research that I'm presenting today addresses the Australian maritime geography. And in particular, I focus on the methods of migration governance that work through mobilities at sea, exploring the significance of systematically keeping migrants mobile and moving them between various maritime geographies. Through drawing mobilities on behalf of governing agents at sea to the fore and the way they structure Australia's maritime migration governance strategies, I propose that there is a need to challenge and perhaps move beyond border discourses to take seriously mobility and carceral mobility as a method of migration containment. So the paper that I've actually sort of just finished and just submitted, it orientates around this case, this event at sea, and a High Court case that follows it. So just to summarize it, in June 2014, Australian authorities detained 157 Tamil asylum seekers at sea for the period of 1 month. An Indian flagged vessel carrying Tamil asylum seekers from Sri Lanka went into distress in the maritime geography of Australia after an oil leak caused a fire in the engine room. On June 29, after contacting the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, the vessel was intercepted by the Royal Australian Navy and Customs and Border Protection Service, and the asylum seekers were boarded on an Australian customs vessel. The boat, for geographical clarity, was intercepted 16 nautical miles of Christmas Island, meaning it was outside Australia's territorial waters, yet within the state's contiguous zone. So it was within the geography within which Australia polices migration. It was decided by Australia's National Security Committee of Cabinet that the asylum seekers should be returned to India, as it had been a transit country in the journey of these asylum seekers. And if you can kind of see on my sort of crude map that I've mocked up, the central drop point in the middle is approximately where they were intercepted. And while it's unclear where in the Indian maritime geography they were taken to, we can see these sort of expansive maritime journey that they endured. So we know now that the journey from Christmas Island to India took 10 days. As no formal agreement had been made to disembark the migrants in India, the customs vessel detaining the migrants was forced to remain offshore while negotiations between India and Australia proceeded. But in the end, no agreement was reached, and after nearly a month detained at sea, the asylum seekers were disembarked at the Australian territory of the Cocos or Keeling Islands, before then being transferred to Curtin Immigration Detention Centre in West Australia, and then later flown to offshore immigration detention in Nauru. So throughout this period of detention, the Australian customs vessel moved to various at-sea destinations, throughout which time the Australian authorities did not inform the asylum seekers or the Australian public where they were located or what their intended destination was. And they also refused to disclose to the public how many people were on board and what their origin country was. Several months after the event, this ad hoc practice of forced mobility and prolonged detention at sea was rendered lawful in the High Court of Australia, with the case CPCF First Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. And the presiding judges ruled that it was a lawful form of detention, in particular claiming that to detain a migrant at sea mandates an obligation to take that migrant somewhere. And as one of the presiding judges, Justice Gagler, notes, detention of a person under the provision triggers a concomitant duty to take that detained person to a place. So as I explore in my article, the term taking is specifically impactful, as the destination of such journeys was left resoundingly vague. So the judges further ruled that there cannot be constriction on the time that is needed to facilitate this sort of vague taking to a place. And in so doing, they legitimated indefinite detention at the sea for the purpose of realizing these journeys. And this was a really impactful case, not only because it sort of normalized this practice in Australia's geography, but also because Australia exists as this sort of international example of an offshore migration governance regime that has managed to sort of successfully stop the boats. And so this case and the at-sea strategies it legitimates holds profound significance internationally. So there's been really important work within critical border studies on migration governance regimes at seas. And there is a great deal of research investigating the changing technologies and techniques of policing migration at sea, the evolving geographies of migration governance, as well as the violence of these agendas. And this research expands knowledge on how borders function at sea and challenges where we understand them to be located. But despite the amorphous nature of contemporary borders and the expansive literature documenting the evolving ways they manifest, what the term border implies across its various applications remains to some extent consistent in that it indicates a delineation between an inside and an outside and the methods of policing and securitizing that perform this keeping out. So I move beyond border language in order to focusability as a method of governance, examining how migrants are contained through being kept mobile at sea. And within this analysis of mobility as governance, there is no clear inside and outside, and this thus complicates the application of the term border. Moreover, rather than limiting migratory journeys, at-sea mobilities work to redirect, prolong, and extend journeys. So focusing on mobility at sea as a method of governance draws to the fore these sort of unique aspects of migration governance at sea and the way, in particular in Australia, it works with and through the maritime geography. This attention to mobility is not distinct to some nascent work that is emerging in security studies. And in particular, Huysmans has articulated the significance of giving primacy to movement, articulating in quotations how conceptualizing life as motion without stasis invites distinct analytics of security, end quote. So as Huysmans emphasizes, this focus on motion encourages, again, I quote him, letting go of defining the politics of security as an enactment of continuously dividing insides and outsides. And this is profoundly relevant to Australia's maritime geography, where migrants are kept mobile for really extensive periods of time, specifically through Australia's governing regimes. So by directing focus to mobilities, we are persuaded to engage with geographies such as the maritime as defined by a series of encounters which lead to onward mobilities, examining the control and containment that such mobilities reflect. So my focus here is not really on crossing or returning, but rather on a movement between points at sea and the method of governance that works through containing and relocating. Sorry, I'm just so, this leads to migrants being subject to the powers of the state while being held at a distance from the state. So I use this term coerced mobility to emphasize the myriad enforced mobilities that take place at sea, which are at once multi-directional, as in the context of Australia, in this case that I illustrate, while at the same time lacking clear concepts of inside and outside. And these mobilities, instructed and enforced by Australian authorities, often lead to more enduring sites of confinement, whether it be Australia's offshore immigration detention centres or detention in third-party states such as Indonesia and Sri Lanka. Yet these vessels are not just carceral due to their connection to broader systems of immigration detention. These coerced mobilities turn the vessel holding asylum seekers into carceral spaces in their own right. And I think there are probably three specific ways in which these mobilities are carceral. Firstly, mobilities at sea are not incidental aspects of migration governance. Rather, they are integral to the design of migration containment. And this is especially the case in Australia. There is an intentionality behind this mobility. Secondly, this mobility is harmful and has a disciplinary intention. So coerced mobility at sea is part of this logic of migration governance, in which states attempt to impede migrants from reaching the state's territory through keeping them mobile and thus unable to claim rights. And along with this as well, it should be noted that there's an explicit architecture of carceral containment on these vessels, which have been sort of ad hoc reconfigured to contain migrants below deck in small spaces. Finally, these mobilities keep migrants under the governing powers of the state while holding them in a condition of reduced rights, suspending them in a deeply carceral circumstance. So within this context of the proliferation of coerced mobilities in Australia's maritime geography, it is worth noting changes to the legal geography of the sea that have facilitated these mobilities. Australia has been systematically hollowing out rights for migrants in maritime geographies for decades, and I address this in an article I published last year in Political Geography, where I examine the carceral wet that emerges from migrants when governments expand policing in the same liquid geographies from which they remove rights. And I don't have the space to detail these changes here. However, It's necessary to note that Australia has removed such rights as the right to asylum for maritime arrivals, as well as the protection against refoulement, which is the protection against returning asylum seekers to places which they are fleeing. So as a result of these changes, the government has and re-territorialized this maritime geography to be neither within a geography of rights nor beyond a geography of policing, thus facilitating this sort of proliferation of various mobilities at sea between maritime geographies. So in 2013, Australia commenced the militarised agenda Operation Sovereign Borders. Under this program, the government announced that Australia was shut to maritime arrivals. And here in the slide, you see a still from a audiovisual propaganda campaign from in 2014, emphasising how Australia was really closed to all maritime arrivals. And to achieve this, the government intensified the scope of coerced mobility at sea with far more exhaustive measures taken, from increasing geographies of interdiction, expanding geographies of at-sea mobility, and extending periods of confinement at sea to facilitate these myriad mobilities. And emphasising the centrality of mobility to this program, the former Immigration Minister and now Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, described the new agenda as one premised upon forcibly repelling maritime migrants. And repelling is this really interesting term because it's not indicating necessarily a return, but rather a sort of taking anywhere. So within a year of the commencement of Operation Sovereign Borders, it was revealed that the Australian authorities had detained these Tamil asylum seekers at sea for the period of 1 month. And a few months later, in October 2014, the case was taken to the High Court of Australia, which is the country's apex court responsible for clarifying the application of domestic law and policy. And the plaintiff was one of the asylum seekers who had been detained at sea. Yet the court ruled by a majority that the detention of asylum seekers for the period of 1 month was not at any time unlawful. And this is an exceptionally interesting case, not just because it ruled this detention to be lawful, the judges in fact contributed to a language which normalized the carceral mobility of migrants at sea and justified such detentions as requisite to the maritime geography. So what was central to this case was the idea that to detain is to take at sea. And this phrase is repeated recursively in the ruling by the presiding judges and declared by two to be the core concern of this case. And this phrase is to some extent implicit. If someone is interdicted and detained at sea on a mobile customs or naval vessel, at some point a taking somewhere else is necessary. Yet in the context of Australia and Australia's migration law more broadly, this taking becomes far more complex. So under Australian law, a migrant arriving by sea can never claim asylum in Australia. Hence, a maritime migrant can only realistically be taken somewhere outside Australia or to an Australian territory for a brief period of time before onward transportation. So in concluding that detaining requires a concomitant taking, the judges sanctioned detention for the purpose of onward mobility in the form of removal. The idea that to detain is to take was made further complex by the judges. Justice Gagler explained in relation to the detention and removal of asylum seekers, and this is the first large quote on this slide, the place to which they are removed need not be a place which is proximate to the place of detention, and it need not be a place with which the detained person has any existing connection. And this statement is significant for so many reasons. But firstly, it detracts from the obligation to disembark rescued persons at the nearest safe port or next port of call. In this sense, it emphasizes that taking is not for the migrant's benefit, but rather to realize this objective of removal. Secondly, it emphasizes that there should be no restriction on the places chosen for disembarkation. And being neither proximate or of relation to the migrant, this statement renders all third-party territories spaces that migrants can be removed to via the sea. The judges also affirm that there should be no restriction on the places chosen for disembarkation, referring in particular to territories where the Australian government has no prearranged agreement to disembark migrants. And they also claimed that these destinations should be able to be changed at any given point. So in rendering third-party territories valid spaces to remove migrants to, the judges indicated that the length of time a migrant is detained at sea is actually not of significant concern. If migrants can be taken across vast maritime geographies to destinations that can change, the period of time in which they are detained is unnecessarily prolonged, as was the case with the Tamil asylum seekers. Through making this conclusion, the judges not only affirmed that the destination was of little importance, they actually legalized indefinite detention at sea for migrants. And this was directly affirmed by several of the judges. Justice Crennan, for example, in this second larger quote says, "It is not necessary to ensure respect for the plaintiff's personal liberty or to avoid indefinite detention or detention at the discretion or whim of the executive government." So in light of this, taking does not lead to a disembarkation that is for the benefit of migrants or the vessels carrying them. Rather, taking denotes a removal to geographies beyond Australia, geographies which need neither be proximate or convenient. So here we see how taking becomes this profoundly impactful term, indicating an expansive form of mobility without constriction. In the rulings made by the presiding judges, there are several important statements which highlight the significance of the maritime geography to the justification of this at-sea detention. In discussing the various onward mobilities that occurred at sea during the detention of the terminal asylum seekers, Justice Keane states that such continuous mobility is hardly surprising given the unpredictability of the circumstances of such voyages.
You've got 2 minutes remaining.
I'll do it, okay.
Thanks.
There was, however, no unforeseeable event that prolonged this detention. There was no shipwreck after the embarkation of the asylum seekers on the customs vessel, nor was there any unforeseen maritime event. The one thing that did prolong the nature of the journey was India refusing disembarkation, which is precisely what the plaintiffs were arguing led to this unfairly extended detention. And there are other statements that were raised by these presiding judges that further emphasize the unpredictability of the maritime as justifying indefinite and prolonged detention. I'll just go to my concluding slide. So between 2013 and 2021, 873 migrants endured coerced mobilities at sea, which culminated in them either being refoulement to the place they were fleeing or taken to a third country. And while this number might pale in the context of the Mediterranean, it is greatly significant in the context of Australia. And in fact, since 2014 and this Tamil asylum case, not one maritime vessel was unable to be returned, meaning all arrivals via the sea were intercepted at sea and taken to various at-sea geographies before being taken somewhere else. So carceral studies scholars have explored this constant mobility that informs carceral systems, including the cyclical movement of visitors, staff, techniques and technologies, and prisoners between and beyond formal penal sites. And the constancy of this mobility has encouraged Monk to ask whether the prison is best defined by its boundary. As Monk articulates, a carceral can perhaps better be understood as, in quotations, restricting or encouraging the mobility of convicted offenders and not as a territory isolated from the rest of society, end quotations. In this sense, the carceral does not produce stasis, but rather emerges in the myriad controlled and coerced mobilities. And focusing on these controlled mobilities shifts our focus away from the liminal geographies that denote a parameter to consider the mobilities that exist as a method of governance. And so this leads us to ask a similar question of migration governance at sea. To what extent is it best defined by a border? I'll just wrap up really quickly. In Australia, the maritime geography is not one in which the inside and outside of the state is easily discernible, as rights of migrants have been annulled while policing regimes have been expanded in these very same liquid geographies. So in other words, the constriction of migratory movements at sea is like the prison, to quote Monk again, not based on crossing, but rather understood through modification of the relative position of the points under consideration. The geography of the maritime is pivotal to this strategy of containment through mobility, with its liquid spatiality in the context of Australia in particular, used to justify movement as necessary, while its ever-changing surface allows such onward mobilities to be justified as indefinite in nature. And I'll wrap up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you ever so much, Andonea. Again, absolutely fascinating. And I think some clear links there with Maurice's presentation, which should make for some interesting discussion. Thank you. So our third and final speaker is Dr. Austin Dziwornu Ablo. He's a senior lecturer at the Department of Geography and Resource Development, University of Ghana, and a visiting scholar at the Center for Humanities, Washington University in St. Louis. Austin obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Geography and Resource Development from the University of Ghana and earned an MPhil and PhD in Development Geography from the University of Bergen in Norway in 2012 and 2016. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Geosciences, University of South Florida in 2017, and his research focuses on urban studies, natural resource governance, energy, entrepreneurship, and development. And the title of Austin's paper is Carceral Labour, Offshore Work Relations, Conflicts, and Local Participation in Ghana's Oil and Gas Industry. Over to you, Austin.
Thank you very much, Helena, for the introduction. And thank you all for joining the presentation. Let me just put up my screen. And I hope everyone can see my slides. Yep. So my presentation is going to be a little bit departure from Andonea and Maurice's presentation on mobility and migration. I'm going to look at how labor practices reflect the extensions of carcerality. My focus is going to be on the oil industry with specific emphasis on offshore work. And so when I talk about offshore work, I'm looking at workers on oil platforms, so oil rigs, floating production, offloading and storage facility, that is FPSOs, which are very important infrastructures in the oil and gas industry. And the FPSOs are currently used once they are able to do production, they do discovery. Oil wells are linked to these production platforms where there is separation and processing, and vessels come to load and go off. The background of my presentation is to look at how labor practices in the offshore infrastructure reflect what I call the micro mechanisms of carceral sea. So beyond confinement, beyond imprisonment, beyond detention, in what ways are practices reflective of carcerality? So the central question is, how do carceral techniques work to limit local participation in the extractive sector? And for a country like Ghana that is the economy dependent on the extractive sector, then it's important to understand the ways in which these relationships can influence the extent to which the country is able to develop from its extractive sector. Conceptually, my emphasis is on the social construction of carceral. So in terms of spaces, practices, and relationship that exist in non-prison spaces, but also work to influence people's actions and inactions. So in 2007, Ghana discovered oil in commercial quantities and started production in 2010, which is not too surprising given the fact that as far back as the 19th century, the country started exploration. There were some level of production, but on limited scale. But as the technology, especially for deep sea exploration advances and became cheaper, then more and more production processes started taking place, especially in the Gulf of Guinea. And of course, if you look at it contextually as well, the fact that US and many countries are trying to move away from dependence on the Persian Gulf for oil and gas, then there is a lot of investment in Africa. And the fact that most of the production in Africa is currently offshore is very suitable because of the fact that even if there are conflicts, companies can continue to produce without much problems or interferences, right? Of course, the production in Ghana is quite modest, 120,000 barrels of oil per day at peak production. Most of the oil production is currently taking place in the western coast of Ghana in what is called the Tunnel Basin. And over the past few years, Ghana has had a conflict with Cote d'Ivoire over the maritime border because some of the wells transcend both countries. That was resolved now. And so one of the issues that the government tried to do was to put in place proper regulatory measures to ensure that the country is able to manage its petroleum resources. And key among them is the local content and local participation law, which was passed in 2013, which has been the subject of my research interest for both my master's and my PhD dissertations. And we also have the Petroleum Revenue Management Act that provides a framework of how government should utilize petroleum resources. Now, if you look at the local content law, basically it requires foreign companies to use local personnel, goods and services at the oil and gas industry value chain. And this is becoming the most important or gaining traction as a policy tool for almost all resource producing country. And this first emerged in the North Sea in the 70s, UK, Norway, and various countries were putting in place measures to ensure that rather than having American companies dominate the oil and gas industry, they put in mechanisms to promote local participation. So within a period of 10, 20, 30 years, you have increasing local businesses, local labor in the industry. And if you look at Ghana's local content law, the emphasis has been on employment creation, technology transfer, local ownership, and local procurement. And if you look at technology transfer, this is promoted through joint ventureship between multinational companies and Ghanaian businesses to ensure that local businesses are able to build capacity to be able to move into the upstream industry. But very critical is the issue of employment, because Ghana and many African countries have very youthful population, but very high unemployment, right? The 2016 labor force report in Ghana, for instance, stated that about 11.9% unemployment rate in Ghana. But that actually glosses over a lot of complex issues, because many people are underemployed in Ghana, even if you are employed. Then you have a large segment of the labor force in the informal sector, with many people moving to the cities, engaging in informal activities, trading, and all of those things. So underemployment is very high, right? So the table here shows, it's just a snapshot of the employment component of the local content law. And it says that between, from the 1st to the 10th year, management staff in the oil industry, so a foreign company, local company, 80% of the staff should be Ghanaian by the 10th year of production. And then technical staff range from 20% at the start to 80%. And then other staff, so low echelon job, entry-level jobs should be 80% Ghanaian at the start and 100% within 10 years, right? So within this context, it is important to see the ways in which carcerality of labor, which for me is the practices and negotiation offshore, influence the extent to which this local content goal can be achieved, right? So the first issue is that if you look at the labor practices in Ghana's oil industry, one of the critical issues that comes to mind is the Carceral Archipelago, right? Which is the mechanisms and techniques of prison that works in society, right? So if you take the FPSOs, the oil rig, one of the first feature is the fact that these are very controlled spaces, right? You have a certain number of crew who must be on board, work 12 hours. I spent, I think, 2 days offshore, right? It's very regimented, very, very controlled. You have to wear uniform, high visibility uniform. So in many ways, you realize that the environment itself, right, reflects some form of a prison structure. And the materiality of the infrastructures, you take FPSO, you take oil rigs, these are located offshore. You need to undergo various processes to get there. And it is not a space you can walk in and walk out like you do in an ordinary office. So you realize that when you look at it in terms of what Foucault calls Carceral Archipelago, is both discursive in terms of the practices and also material in terms of the nature of the infrastructures that you have offshore, right? So what is critical is the fact that the carceral mechanisms operate to lock people's current and future possibilities. And so if you look at the local content law, it requires that foreign companies must train Ghanaians to get the skills to take over the jobs. And so you have a situation where you are being asked to train somebody who will replace you. So what happens is that the expatriate workers, once they start training the Ghanaians after a year or two, they start giving them bad reviews, right? And the bad reviews results in people being demoted, or in many cases, people being sacked. You also have the situation where no Ghanaian is directly employed offshore by a foreign company. So you have Cosmos, Talo, Anadako, Petro SA, and different companies, Slumberger, all of them that operate in Ghana. But all these companies that operate offshore will recruit Ghanaians through third parties. So they don't employ the people directly. And that puts the people in a particular position because before you could go offshore, you need a certification, you need training, irrespective of your skills. And those training are done by the local recruitment company, which are also complicated political organizations. Many of them are front for foreign business and all of that. And after training the Ghanaians, they own the labor, right? And determine who can go offshore and who cannot go. And so when people are unfairly treated, they said, well, you either take it or leave it. Okay, so the autonomy or the agency of workers diminish within these carceral practices offshore. And there have been many instances of verbal abuse, many instances of bad reviews, which are very unfair, right? But people's options are limited. Of course, you have to look at it in the context of the fact that if you leave the job, you have no option. You probably become unemployed. The average Ghanaian could be graduates from with a bachelor's degree could take up to 13 years on the average to get a job. So in that context, you realize that people's possibilities are locked. The other issue is also labor casualization. So rather than employ people as full-time workers, where you pay their pension, you pay their insurance and all of those things, they give them short-term contracts, so 3-month contract, 6-month contract, 10-month contract, which are reviewed periodically. What it means is that if there are unfair practices, there are wage disparities, sometimes over 70% disparity between local and expatriate workers, and you make agitation, the next contract review, you lose your job, right? So you have to accept what you're given. And there have been instances where a number of Ghanaians on the FPSO, for instance, went on a sit-down strike because of the fact that they do similar work with expatriates, but they experience wage disparity of over 150%, right? So they went on a sit-down strike, and that was a big national security issue because the environment is controlled. They are pumping oil, they are pumping gas, production must go on. The government managed to convince them to come offshore, and all of them were laid off. A couple of them were reinstated, but demoted to a sent elsewhere and all of that. And so we realized that the short-term contract increased vulnerability of workers to termination, right? So if you look at it, you realize that carcerality of offshore is not limited to the physical space or working environment, but what embedded in the recruitment process, the type of employment people get, and the labor practices in the oil and gas industry. Okay. So what are some of the key reflections we can take? That spaces of control and surveillance have no special fix, right? So beyond the prison, even on the oil industry, there are cameras all over, there's surveillance all over, you have to clock in, clock out, and all of that. And this is diffused to onshore daily life through what the company is called We Own the People. We train them, so we own them, right? There is also the issue of what? The carceral condition. What Moran discussed as for carceral condition, we're looking at detriment, intent, and what? Speciality. So there is the fact that the practices of expatriate trainers work against Ghanaians, leads to job losses, leads to demotion. So you have people who have been, after about 10 years working, should have progressed to being tool pushers or subsea engineers or whatever skill they should get. They keep going back and starting from the low echelon jobs again. Again, in terms of speciality, you realize that the infrastructures itself creates a room or limit the extent to which people can mobilize, the extent to which labor can agitate, the extent to which people can demand fair wages and salaries, right? So some concluding
You've got
thoughts.
2 minutes.
Okay,
2 minutes left.
This is my final slide.
Thanks.
Yeah, so some concluding thoughts are that carcerality of offshore labor manifests through lived experiences of confinement on the rigs, the relationships that exist between employers and employees, relationships that exist between multinational companies and local recruitment companies, and how that influences the recruitment processes and the labor condition, right? So when you look at it carefully, you realize that when we use the carceral condition as an analytical frame, our understanding of the relationship between natural resource extraction and development moves beyond the macro level political and economic analysis, right? And you realize that everyday practices in the offshore environment influences the extent to which resource extraction can lead to development, right? So new kinds of carceral spaces are being created in offshore extractions, right? And if you place emphasis on them, you realize that we are able to understand how carceral spaces depotentialize labor force and reinforces what? Global inequality, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. If you're happy to stop sharing your screen, that would be great. Thank you ever so much for that. That was, again, fascinating stuff. As you say, quite a different topic to the 2 previous papers, but there are clearly connections to be made there in terms of how we think about carceral seas and the carceral characteristics of these spaces and practices. So thank you again to all 3 of our speakers, all very thought-provoking papers. I think we've got a lot to talk about, but before we do, we're just going to take a quick comfort break. So if we take 5 minutes, that takes us very neatly to 3:10 UK time. Please feel free to grab a drink. Please also do start putting your questions into the chat and giving your thoughts and feedback on what we've heard so far. And yes, we'll be back very shortly. So see you in 5 minutes. Thanks.